Welcome to the Dynamic Leadership Live series. In this series, I'm laying out the dynamic leadership approach for leadership, both one-to-one, which is what I call for team leadership. That's how you get high performance in teams. And then one-to-many, which would be the executive leadership, the executive level, setting the climate. Now, leadership is often taught as a set of visible behaviors: communication, decision-making, motivation. But those behaviors are only the final stage of a much deeper process. Before action actually happens, something always occurs first. People interpret situations, they regulate internal reactions, and then they decide how to respond. Most of that happens incredibly fast, often in fractions of a second. And that's why leadership is not just what you say or what you do. Leadership is about the conditions that shape how people respond under pressure. And this is important. And I'll lay that out in 2 steps today. So executive leadership, one-to-many. As organizations grow, leadership stops being primarily about personal effort and starts becoming more about organizational conditions. Early in a company's life, results are driven by direct involvement. The founder is everywhere. Decisions are centralized. But as complexity increases, outcomes depend less on what the leader personally does and more on how the organization itself responds to uncertainty and change. And this is why many people will say that an owner or CEO who says that they can't influence or don't or are not responsible for culture, they say that's incorrect. When I look at executive leadership one-to-many, that shift creates 3 distinct leadership domains. The first is leading one-to-one, as I just covered. And this is the frontline leadership environment where managers work directly with individuals to stabilize performance, guide development, and help people regulate themselves under pressure. The second domain is leading one-to-many. Now, this is executive leadership, the role of shaping the environment, setting the climate that determines how thousands of individual decisions unfold across the organization. And the third domain is development architecture, leadership development architecture, as well as employee development, how people are trained, how they're onboarded. And this is very important because it sets the tone and the stage, how they grow over time. Because if development is inconsistent, leaders spend their time correcting problems that could have been prevented months or years earlier. The reality is that organizations often focus heavily on strategy and execution. It makes sense, that's where the money is. But strategy and execution occur after something more fundamental has already happened. People have interpreted the situation, their nervous system has reacted, their habits have activated, and only then do behaviors appear. Which means that if we want sustained performance, leadership must operate upstream of behavior. And that's where dynamic leadership lives, not only helping leaders respond to problems, but helping them shape the conditions where better responses emerge naturally. So I want to illustrate what I mean by rapid recovery. Rapid recovery comes from my 7-step reset, which is the foundation for individual performance, stability under pressure. When you look at what actually happens, most people have heard of stimulus response. So you have your stimulus and you have your response. The stimulus is actually stimulus reaction. And the reason I draw it like this is because one side is happening in the network of neurons, and the other is happening in the conscious mind. Now, after the response, we have a post-response area. And before the stimulus, we have a... Just to point out, it's the obvious, but the post-response area is the pre-stimulus area for the next stimulus. And the pre-stimulus area is the post response for the last one. The reason this is important is because if we're not careful about what goes on right here, we have the potential to stack challenges and problems over and over and over. See, this happens 33,000 times a day. And when I talk about rapid recovery, the stimulus reaction is like the first half of a second. And there's also this small area here, which is pre-listening. So the whole thing is roughly 600 milliseconds. That 600 milliseconds sets the trajectory, because this, you could break it up into three parts. You could break it up into initial detection, and that goes to rapid appraisal, and that goes to reaction formation. So in other words, in this 600 milliseconds, you have 3/3. The first 2/10, that includes the pre-listening and then the initial detection. The second 2/10, rapid appraisal, and then the third 2/10, reaction framing or formation, reaction formation, and then that hands it off to the conscious mind. The conscious mind cannot interpret directly the signals going through the neural pathway. So the network of neurons is all about the neural pathways, and habits live in the neural pathways. Habits are the path of least resistance. So all that's happening here. So while the conscious mind has a reaction time of a half second, people may not realize there's a lot going on in this first half second. The subconscious it's not like the conscious mind is just slow. It's waiting for this information to come through, because this side processes at 11 million bits per second. This side processes at 50 bits per second. So it needs this information in order to respond. Now, it made a lot of sense for the hunter-gatherers, I'm sure, because their life at 35 was the same as 5 years old. And so the conditioning that happens for us still today from 0 to 7 matches what they're going to be doing for the rest of their life, essentially. Today, obviously, is different. That's why I call it a reset, the 7-step reset, because we're resetting our conditioning to match what we need for today and moving forward. So because this happens 33,000 times a day, most of those are at the unconscious level. You're not even aware of it. But when you get triggered, what can happen is, if this is what's normal, right? You're going through, you're getting your stimulus reactions, and this has happened all these times per day. And as long as everything is fine, you're fine. This is just a normal day. And sometimes you have a spike where something bad happens and you get triggered and you're going along, and then all of a sudden this sends you up there. Now, if you get another stimulus that comes very quickly while you're kind of working it out, you could go to there. Next thing you know, you're catastrophizing. And this may not be you, but you may have seen someone do this. And then they're up here. Now, once they're up here, if they get another stimulus response situation, stimulus reaction and then response, they're already compromised. The fight or flight is already in. By the time they're here, the chemicals are flowing, the cortisol, the adrenaline, and now they're compromised. What we want to do is rapid recovery. And as you're going along, you get this spike. By recovering quickly, and I'm just illustrating this for simple purposes, but you can come back down. So what does this mean? In practical terms, it's like this. This is happening so fast, it's at the subconscious level. In order to do something with it, you have to condition it in at the subconscious level. The same way you train an animal to respond a certain way to a given association, it's the same thing we're doing here. We're creating associations. But this is not knowledge. You can't do this with knowledge because it's neural pathways. Those neurons get wrapped with myelin. Synapses connects the neurons together. Synaptogenesis prunes the synapses from the unused neural pathways and puts it into the active neural pathways. And through this process, it's replacing old habits with new habits. That's why it's easier to replace a habit rather than break a habit, because the habit has neurons that are wrapped with myelin, and that becomes the path of least resistance. When you allow this to happen in yourself with this catastrophization, you are influencing the subsequent stimulus response cycles, and you got 33,000 of them a day. The reason why you're influencing them is, one, they're coming so fast, but two, once you're in fight or flight mode, you're already amped up, and you're most capable of showing up as the best version of yourself when you're in coherence. So this would be coherence. So this is the idea. So we already did the drawing, right, of coherence. Now imagine that you have a range and you're operating inside this range, and that's coherence. And this is where we want to be, because when we're in coherence, we are most able to show up as the best version of ourselves. We're most able to use what we know. I often say to know and not do is not much better than not knowing, but it's not just that we only retain a certain amount of what we learn. We can only access a certain amount of what we know when we're triggered. This is why we want to stay in coherence to the degree possible. If this is coherence, now we have these zones. And when you drop below, you go into rigidity. When you go above, you go into chaos. So this is a much more difficult, because now other things have happened. You've created problems for people around you. There's just this domino effect of going on. So rapid recovery is all about catching these spikes early and redirecting them. Because if we don't catch them early and redirect them, what you can get is that into the chaos or into the rigidity. And you could think of rigidity as a fixed mindset. Chaos is exactly what it says, but you're going to have a lot more activity, a lot of wasted time, a lot of energy being expended, and it's not going for good. And some of the things that you can do to support this as a leader, because this is what's happening at the individual level. The leader's responsibility is to detect it early and, if possible, intervene so that it breaks the pattern. As an individual, while we can't interpret directly what's going on in the neural pathways, everyone has sensed this thing that comes up. It's like they see something or hear something, and immediately, there's like this internal sensation that happens. That's the network of neurons. That's the nervous system picking up some information. Because remember, the nervous system is connected to the senses, right? So it picked up some information. It's now in that early detection stage or initial detection of what's going on. What do we need to do? This is a risk. This is a threat. This is like that other thing that happened, and it starts to come up. It may show up as telling tension. It may show up as shutting down. And you first have to learn how to sense it in yourself and trust it. Malcolm Gladwell in his book Blink talked about it as thin slicing. But that's that first thing that comes up, and you can't define it. And in his book Thin Slicing, he said that these art experts were able to detect the fake, but they couldn't explain why. Well, that's because the nervous system picked up on the inconsistencies, but consciously we don't know it. I remember in Ranger training, we had to identify tanks. This was in the Cold War days, but we had to identify tanks as they would flash across the screen. And they would just flash them faster and faster and faster, where all you saw was just like this black flash go across the screen, and you had to answer whether it was a friendly tank or an enemy tank. And it was amazing how many we got right, because we learned to trust that I'll call it thin slicing, but it's that first thing that comes up. That's the first signal. As a leader, you can see that in your people as well. Anyone who's been speaking before a group or delivering a message has witnessed that telling tension that comes up. You can see the person they just kind of perk. Different ways that it happens, and you can't tell exactly what is going on. You can't tell what they are feeling or thinking. You just know that something shifted. And that's where the leader can say, I want to pause here. Let's just do a quick check-in. What's coming up for people? Has anyone experienced anything like this before? Because that thing that came up just made an association, or it's referencing an association between what it's hearing now and what was before. And that feeling that comes up, you can see it because it's a physical, like the network of neurons, it's physiology. Energy is going through them, but it's physiology, and that's why that thing changes. And so you want to pay attention to this. And there's things that you can do as a leader to prevent some of those spikes by providing context. You got to be careful in providing context because the context can also create an association. You don't know what these associations are. You don't know what people have gone through, and you don't know what word you use will trigger it. You just have to be ready to spot it and then do something about it. That's why it's called dynamic leadership. The same way dynamic traction works, the same way dynamic traction control and dynamic suspension works. It's not predicting the road surface, it's responding to the road surface so quickly. And for the dynamic suspension, it's so quickly that the rapid recovery makes it appear like it's completely stable. And that's what you want with your teams. You want it to appear stabilized, not because it's perfectly stable, but because the rapid recoveries are so quick. The same way on an airplane, you don't notice all the adjustments the pilot is making as they're flying. But if you look in the cockpit, you'll see the hands moving, but you don't feel all those movements. And it's because they're recovering at the micro level and they're not letting those deviations become too large. So we got frameworks. I love frameworks. Last time we talked about RACI. Responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. It's a good way to, as you're organizing the work, it's a good way to also clarify roles. But having frameworks helps, just like they said, it frames things. It frames things in such a way that people are less likely to spike out of that, and they stay present. I think one-to-one meetings is important. That's why I call it one-to-one leadership, even though it's teams. You want to have one-to-one because this is where you can apply the autonomy, competence, and relatedness. You can convey these and you can give feedback, because if you leave people alone too long, remember the subconscious is biased towards negative, and that subconscious will be off and running and everything is a bad thing, and it's starting to help that catastrophizing, and the one-on-ones help you answer that stuff along the way. Also, I like to give feedback, and feedback is important, obviously. And you may have heard the thing 3-to-1. So 3 positive or praises, 3 positive types of feedback for every 1 negative, for every 1 reprimand. And this gets away from the leave alone zap. And what I advocate is if you give feedback regularly, you always have enough positives in the bank to give that reprimand. And even a neutral piece of feedback can come in as positive feedback. The reason it comes in as positive feedback is because you're giving them guidance to know that they're on the right path. And that's where I talk about the blue, red, and white language. That's in another video, but the short version is that blue is observable behavior, and the way you do it, it connects the good feeling to the thing that they did, which taps into dopamine and serotonin, and it becomes habit forming, versus red language, which attaches the good feeling to the leader or the manager. And that kind of leads to this behavior where people perk up and get more engaged when the boss is around. What we want is the engagement when the boss is not around. And then I already mentioned framing and context. And so if you're going to introduce information about organizational change, and you know it's not going to affect your team, and that's a true statement that it's not going to affect your team at all, you may want to reference that at first. I've got to share some things with you. There's some organizational changes. None of it's going to impact the team here. As a matter of fact, our team is actually going to support this next initiative, and then you can talk about it, because otherwise people are going to think, am I going to get riffed? Remember, you are their connection to the organization, and the organization, for many people, it just represents a paycheck. And I know you may want them to be more engaged than that, but if that's their paycheck and their livelihood and their sole breadwinner in the family, then you've got to manage that, or it's going to go get out of whack. So that was just a quick overview of what I meant by rapid recovery, and this is what is the responsibility of the frontline leader. First, you have to have coherence, agency, personal leadership over ourselves. And then we have to be able to detect it, and support the same in others. Leading one-to-one. Again, I use one-to-one, but you could be leading a team of 12 people, but you're going to have one-to-one interactions with them. You're going to have one-on-one meetings, because the highest form of discrimination is treating everyone the same. People have different needs. Some people have tight alignment between their personal goals and purpose and the organization. Others don't. But at the end of the day, they're all there to do a job. And so you're going to have a different conversation with everyone. You're not going to treat everyone the same. And this is part of the autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So to understand the architecture of leadership, we start with the smallest unit of performance, the individual. Every organization, regardless of size, is ultimately a collection of individuals responding to situations. And every one of those individuals is operating through a rapid internal process. Stimulus, reaction, response, action, and then recovery, and then repeat. This cycle repeats thousands of times each day, which means performance problems rarely begin at the action stage. They begin earlier. They begin in interpretation, in the reaction that forms before the conscious mind fully understands what just happened. This is where one-to-one leadership matters most, because high-performance teams are not built only in group meetings. They are built in the one-to-one conversations between leaders and individuals. Those conversations shape how people interpret pressure, how they recover from mistakes, how they regulate themselves when things become uncertain. And that is where intrinsic motivation begins to form. Not in speeches, not in slogans, but in consistent individual relationships where people experience autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Those three conditions are the foundation of intrinsic motivation. When they're present, people begin to take ownership of their performance. Remember, intrinsic motivation is the person enjoying the work that they're doing. It's not just that they like it, they're actually getting reinforcement and pleasure from it. And that's where that blue language helps. When they're absent, leaders are forced to rely on pressure, control, and extrinsic factors. The key insight here is temporal. Upstream leadership at the one-to-one level happens earlier in the performance cycle. The leader learns to detect signals early, changes in tone, shifts in energy, small interpretation errors. This is what I was talking about, noticing it early, being able to detect it. And what we want to do is manage the coherence for extended periods of time so people are able to show up as their best. Now, moments where the reaction trajectory begins moving in the wrong direction is where we want to insert some form of an intervention. And it could be something that's telling me what's coming up for you. And when those signals are noticed early, the leader can intervene early. Responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. Now, in a small organization, it could be the same person for consulted and informed. The same person could be responsible and accountable, but by driving this common language into your organization early, people are familiar with it, they're used to using it, and this is how you get the autonomy, because you're literally setting the boundaries for where they can have some autonomy, and then they can start working on their competence. Another good one is the Eisenhower matrix. This is the important versus urgent. So if it's important and not urgent, let's do it here. If you have important, not urgent, and you have important and urgent, this is quadrant 1. This is where you want people to be. You want them to be working on the important stuff when it's not urgent. This is quadrant 2. It's important and urgent. By spending more time in the important, not urgent, your matrix tends to shift. Now, of course, this would be not important and urgent, and this would be not important and not urgent. And in an organization, you may, in personal life, you're probably doing a lot of things that are not urgent and not important. That's your recreation. But in the organization, what we're moving towards is a matrix that looks more like that. So you're working on the important, not urgent. And that's just another example of a framework that leaders can use to help manage and organize, keep things organized. Talked about upstream for one-to-one is time, because you're moving earlier into the stimulus reaction, right? You're catching it earlier and ideally moving before that, so you're keeping them calm and coherent before the stimulus happens. So that's time. You're moving earlier. In the one-to-many with executives, the upstream is orientation. Once organizations grow beyond a certain size, another shift occurs. Leadership becomes less about individual interaction and more about orientation. At this level, the executive role is not primarily about decisions. It's about conditions. Executives shape the environment where thousands of decisions occur. They define the orientation of the organization. This is what I was talking about, the curbs, and they put these in place early. Things like purpose, vision, mission, strategic priorities, objectives, and capabilities. These help to drive that orientation. The expected behaviors and decision frameworks are outcomes of that. Now, all of these elements establish direction before the organization encounters pressure. This is upstream leadership in a different dimension, not temporal, but structural. Executives are not primarily adjusting trajectories moment by moment like the frontline leader is, and certainly like the person is for themselves. They're designing the landscape that determines how those trajectories form in the first place. When this orientation is clear, organizations operate with coherence. People understand what matters. They understand how to prioritize. They understand how decisions should be made when uncertainty appears. But when orientation is unclear, the opposite happens. Teams interpret situations differently. Energy fragments, decisions conflict, and the organization begins to oscillate between urgency and confusion. The executive role is to reduce that fragmentation, to reduce both the frequency and the amplitude of incoherence across the organization. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is through development. That's why I always talk about development plans for all roles. Organizations often treat onboarding as an administrative event. Forms, policies, checklists, but onboarding is actually the first stage of the organization's development structure. I look at it as taking a full 90 days to get them oriented. And I did another talk on this because of this thing of allostasis, where you want to build a trajectory of upward movement rather than gravitating towards status quo, which happens if you don't have the development plans, because the person is constantly looking for what else is expected of me, what's expected of me, and you answer that with development plans. And because the development plans are progressive and ongoing, there's always something more expected, so they're always showing up. This is a nervous system thing. They're always showing up as expecting more. When you don't have that development plan, you don't have context to talk about what else is expected of them, and you wait until something's needed, then you share it. Now it's like episodic. It's going along and then blip, going along, blip, versus going along and each time having to raise the level because more is expected. It's where the nervous system of the organization begins to learn the game that it's playing. In those early months, people internalize how problems are solved, how pressure is handled, how initiative is rewarded or discouraged. If clarity is installed early, capability expands naturally. If ambiguity is installed early, leaders spend the next year correcting problems that never needed to exist. This is why development plans matter, not as HR documents, but as leadership infrastructure. The most effective organizations think in multi-year development horizons, because capability takes time to compound. When development is intentional, something powerful happens. The organization becomes a training environment. People continuously build new capabilities. Innovation becomes normal, and resilience increases. This is also where coherence emerges, because development cascades the conditions that enable intrinsic motivation, autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy gives people freedom to act. Competence gives them the capability to act effectively. Relatedness connects their effort to something larger than themselves. When those three conditions cascade through the organization, performance becomes self-reinforcing. I should say high performance becomes self-reinforcing. And leadership shifts from constant correction to sustained alignment. That is the upstream work of one-to-many leadership. Designing the orientation and development architecture that allows coherent performance to emerge across the entire organization. So I'll walk through a summary using some slides so you grab some screenshots and just have a way to refer back to this. So the four pillars of emotional intelligence, self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management are foundational to dynamic leadership. This is not competing with emotional intelligence. What it does is it moves the action points upstream because we have information now that wasn't available at the time of emotional intelligence around how the subconscious works and neuroplasticity, and that the subconscious is actually a network of neurons, it's not a mind, and that you can predict what the habits are going to be and form habits because you understand that myelin wraps neurons and this makes them fire more accurately, more consistently, and that becomes the path of least resistance. That's why I say habits reside in the network of neurons. This was not known 30 and 40 years ago because the research had not been completed around myelin and myelination and synapsis and the synaptogenesis and how that happens. And all that comes together into a word, neuroplasticity. So if you want to know more about it, just look up neuroplasticity and go down the rabbit holes and you'll see some of these phrases mentioned. So self-determination theory is also foundational here, and it's the core to intrinsic motivation. So the point is we want to have intrinsic motivation because it can scale. You can keep scaling that. You teach people, and the ones who get it and are using it consistently, those become the short list for who's going to get promoted. Others who may not be their cup of tea. All organizations need steady eddies. But also by having development plans in this direction, it makes it easier for people to self-deselect. If they recognize they're not a fit for the organization, they'll know it before you do, and there's ways to make that turn into the next productive step for them, rather than deal with performance management programs and plans that could take 2 and 3 years and not move the needle. By having development plans, people are going to self-deselect because they won't like the stress of not measuring up, and they can't hide. It's like a light is shining on the behavior all the time. But I don't look at development plans as negative or as performance management. This is about, just like a football team or a sports team, if they bring on a new player who's experienced, they're still going to have development plans for that player. And they're always going to have practices and exercises, and they're always going to be increasing the demands. So it's the same thing. We just don't have that discipline with business because you can get away with it without doing it. But the high performance ones, not so much. So this is from individuals to organizations. With individuals, we talk about the 7 performance areas: mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, relationship, professional, and financial. Here we talk about the orientation for the leader, the purpose, the vision, the mission, priorities, etc. And we use a 7-step reset for the individual. We use a 7-step model for organizations because all individuals are dealing with the stimulus response, and this is the 1-second model, where 7 phases of the 1-second model. This is where you're pre-listening, your initial detection, rapid appraisal, and then formation, reaction formation. This is the handoff to the conscious mind because it has to convert that neural pathway signal into something that the conscious mind can understand, like a thought, a sensation, a picture, something like that. So the 7-step reset, recovery as a performance multiplier. This is what I was talking about for frontline leaders. Interrupt that pattern, return to presence, restore coherence, and emotional modulation before escalation. This is the responsibility of the individual as well, but because the leaders know what's coming, they're in a position to detect when a spike is starting, and then they can have early intervention to adjust the trajectory and stop that spike. None of this works with suppression. If you suppress it, all you do is amplify the signal that's trying to get attention. You have to process it. That's why I use the term modulation. So if you look at regulation, as the term is used, like emotional intelligence says, emotional regulation, it's you have first prevention, then you have modulation, and then you have correction. But the whole thing is regulation. Emotional intelligence tends to be more over here with the correction, because the information about the nervous system, network of neurons, path of least resistance as habits, etc., wasn't known. Now that we know that, and we know that it processes so fast, there's things we can do, just like traction control and ABS does for a car. We can do that in our interactions because you detect those things early. The key is understanding that thing you're detecting is a feeling, a physiological event that's coming up. And you see flashes of it on the face, the neck tightening, breath getting shallow. But you don't wait. If you wait for them to speak, now it becomes a narrative. And if you leave it as a narrative, it becomes part of their identity and something that needs to be defended. And then it's very difficult to change. When it's just coming up, it's very malleable. You have the best opportunity to shift the trajectory. Just a simple clarification. Oh yeah, no, it's that. It's not this. And that removes that association. So we could talk more about that, but this is beyond the scope of this talk today. From principle to practice, leadership is not the application of tools, but the creation of conditions where the right actions become obvious. So there's a model, leadership and intrinsic motivation. This is a circle of influence. You may recall this from 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, circle of influence and the circle of concern. So the attention, we want to have the attention on the circle of influence, not on the circle of concern. There's too many things that are out of our control. There's always stuff going on. Ray Dalio in his book, The Changing World Order, talks about there being 5 wars. And we're currently in the U.S., I'm recording this in March of 2026. There's currently all of these wars going on at some level. It's the geopolitical wars, the trade wars, the capital wars, the technology wars, and the military wars. So you've seen the technology wars with the AI, military war, I don't need to say any more about that. The trade wars with the tariffs, and then the geopolitical wars where you have organizations getting upended because of shifts that are happening. So there's a lot that's going on. We have to focus on the circle of influence, what we can do something about. And one of the ways we do that is have a tight purpose and orientation, a clear vision of what's out of scope, or a clear identification of what's out of scope. And then you have what's discretionary, but most of this is not something you're going to be doing. If this is a clock face and this is 12, this is 8, this is 4, I would say from 10 to 2 is anything outside of that is out of scope. And from 1 to 11, that's a cone of 60 degrees. That gives you your cone of focus, 60 degrees. You can pivot back and forth inside of that without disrupting anything, without giving up energy. But all of this other stuff, why worry about it? You can always check in on it once a quarter, but you've got KPIs to tell you when to pay attention to something. So just keep moving forward. And then you have intention. So this gets to the orientation I was referring to. The what, the why, what's in scope, what's out of scope, guiding principles, and output. And by framing these and communicating these for initiatives, innovations, new projects, you're able to foster autonomy. Because when people have guiding principles and they know it's in scope and out of scope, they have a lot of information in terms of where they should be paying attention to, what they should be expending energy on. So frontline leaders adjust the trajectory early. I've mentioned this. Frontline leaders improve performance by recognizing reaction signals and guiding recovery before the behavior locks in. This is what I was talking about. When you catch it at that first what's coming up level, because the network of neurons is processing at 11 million bits per second, you get so much advantage by catching this while it's still going on in the unconscious, because after that happens, that 600 milliseconds, it hands it off to the conscious mind. Once the conscious mind gets it, it turns it into meaning, and then meaning becomes truth, and then it's harder to defend and change, etc. So notice early reaction signals, stabilize emotional state before decisions are made, guide interpretation through coaching conversations, and the coaching conversations start with questions. What's going on for them? Find out what's coming up. You can't predict what they know or think or feel, but you can ask them and they can tell you. The other thing is, on this point, onboarding, there's several conversations that you have where you're really listening to the person and what's important to them. And this is an opportunity for the leader to calibrate how this person communicates when they're safe, because you want to know very quickly when they don't feel safe. And that when you calibrate how they communicate when they feel safe, it'll be obvious when they don't feel safe, because you'll see it come up. And enable rapid recovery so performance remains coherent. When leaders intervene early, teams recover faster and sustain high performance under pressure. And you don't get this infighting, because that starts with the little thing that comes up. And if you ignore it thinking it'll go away, it might go away. And a lot of leaders have learned not to bring that stuff up, because it's like opening a can of worms, but that could be because they've been avoiding it. But when you catch it early, when you first see this first sensation come up, then it doesn't have meaning yet. And it's very, like I said, malleable. You can easily adjust that trajectory with information. It helps to remember that if it's coming up from the network of neurons, aka subconscious, it's related to the past. If something's coming up within a quarter of a second or inside of a half second, you can pretty much rest assured it's coming from the past, associations. And the network of neurons, because there's trillions of connections, 100 billion neurons, each connected to 1,000 or 10,000 other neurons. There's so many associations, it's easy for it to link this with that. And if that created pain for them, now they're connected to that. They bring that up, and then next thing you know, other people are starting to think about it. So by catching it early, you're just disconnecting the association. It's this, it's not that. So executives lead by shaping the system. This is what I was referring to when I said orientation. So if you think about the frontline leader moving in time to go earlier in the stimulus reaction response cycle, you want the leader in the executive one-to-many to move up in orientation. So upstream for frontline leaders is temporal time, moving closer towards and even before the stimulus by driving coherence, and the executives is moving upstream. So orientation, as I said, purpose, vision, capabilities, and then decisions and behavior and stimulus response, these become the domain at the front line, but the leader's focusing on this up here. And there's a motherhood and apple pie. So and you've purpose, vision, mission, but also strategic priorities or goals, objectives, capabilities, and then this is what you expect. Too often people will have a purpose, or not so much purpose in business, but a vision statement and a mission statement, and they don't do anything with it. I would say that thing needs to be a living document. You need to talk about it when you're creating new innovations. This is how you stay in that tight cone around the 12 o'clock direction. I was using the clock face. 1 to 11 is 60 degrees. That's 30 degrees on either side of your direction of purpose. There's plenty of room for wiggle, but then you can wiggle within that without losing momentum. And so purpose, vision, and mission and strategic priorities help frame that and keep it in front of people. I wouldn't put the vision statement in the drawer. And here's the 7-step reset. So this is where I was saying, this happens 33,000 times a day. This is where I was saying the frontline leader, by extending this step 2. So you have pre-stimulus. This is knowledge. This is their state, and are they coherent? And if you can extend this state, this step 2, you're going to have less reactivity here because they're already calm. They're not being triggered. And then the steps 4, 5, 6, and 7 are post-response, and that ends with the recovery, so you're ready to come back here. So as a leader, I'm looking at steps 7, 1, and 2, 7, 1, and 2. I'm expecting that the training, experience, and knowing their jobs takes care of 3 to 6. But here's where I'm paying attention. I want to make sure people get back to coherence after anything rough has happened. And so prepare capability and create presence. That's steps 1 and 2. I'll blast through these. Productive tension, steps 3 and 6. So the leader, whereas the front line is doing, the leader sometimes has to hold tension between the decision of what to do and taking action. This is what I talk about circling. Leaders have to circle. You don't want to just land on the first convenient decision, because you just create more and more problems. By circling, by holding tension, by allowing multiple things to be true at the same time, working towards a MECE, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, to make sure that you figured everything out, looking at it through a first principles lens. Some of your type A people won't be patient for that. They don't want to sit through that. But as Einstein said, if he had an hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes solving it. It's the same thing here. You have to hold on to that tension to allow the problem-solving process to unfold. And then return to organizational coherence is also the responsibility of the frontline leader and the senior leader. We want to make sure that we're staying in this organizational coherence. Every cycle of action must end with stabilization. You can use after-action reports, you can use postmortems, but do something, having feedback to where people are not bringing in past hurts and then into the next thing, and then they're bringing them into operations, etc. High performance requires hygiene, just like a sports team. They have to debrief the loss from the prior weekend, and so that they could get going and show up as the right version of themselves for the next weekend. That's that process. You do that as an organization too. And you don't have to do any of this, but the reason I have dynamic leadership is because there are people who want high-performing organizations, and high performance is a narrow set of inputs. You can do anything and have performance, but to have high performance, it takes a narrower view of that. The same way championship teams have different rigor and a different level of protocol than the middle of the pack, and certainly the teams at the other end. So reflect and integrate learning, restore clarity of direction, reinforce shared understanding, reset emotional and operational alignment. And after action reports and postmortems are a thing. You can go Google them and come up with your own version of how you want to do that. Recovery transforms experience into capability and prevents accumulated friction. Just like, and it's kind of fractal, just like we don't want people spiking and catastrophizing on the little things, we don't want them to carry too much friction across functions and across work. And here's a 7-step model, but for organizations. So here's the 7 steps. It's knowledge, it's state. Step 3 is the stimulus reaction. 4 is the response. 5 is emotional modulation if that's needed. And then you have action and return. Leadership at scale. Executives do not manage activity. They regulate the conditions that produce performance. Again, that's what I was drawing with the chaos and the buffers of the coherence. I was drawing that with the coherence and the buffers of chaos and rigidity. This is where leaders are focusing. They're maintaining that coherence so people can show up. This way they can focus on, and the organization can focus on pursuing the strategy. They're not getting knocked off track. So capability enables autonomy, coherence enables adaptation, tension enables insight, and recovery enables growth. When coherence becomes systemic, performance stops depending on individuals and begins compounding through the organization. Again, I was saying that if you just want to stay status quo, you already know how to do that. This dynamic leadership is for that person who wants a higher performing organization, who wants an environment that's intrinsic for the people who work there. It's difficult to break out of this. As is shown in the book Good to Great by Jim Collins, it's very difficult to break out of this. There's a barrier. There's a barrier for individuals. There's a barrier for organizations. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance happens to get through here, which is why I say it's a narrow set of skills and capabilities and actions that lead to high performance. And this is what we're after. So this is also like in Good to Great. The companies were going along, and then the great companies broke out. They had an inflection point, and the criteria for Good to Great, they had to maintain that upward trajectory in their performance for 15 years. I put unknown and unfamiliar here because that is the new problem. When you're here, you have your experience and your conditioning to keep you inside the band. When you're up here, you don't have that. So you use principles and near principles. This is the point about strengths, consistency, simplicity. So you're going to be methodical and consistent. And this way you're not chasing all the shiny things, the VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and you're not dealing with threats because you know your system works and there's reversion to the mean. Now that mean is moving, but still you already understand how to deal with threats. You have the problem solving capabilities. You know how to deal with crisis. When something shows up, you know what to do because you've got development plans in place and you're doing these things proactively. So I go live every week, Monday, Tuesday, Fridays, typically a session like this. Wednesday I do an Ask Me Anything, mainly on LinkedIn. And then Thursdays I usually have workshops, leadership and sales type workshops. And that's it. So we will see you on Monday.